and welcome back to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast for this new season. Hope everybody had a lovely summer, and we're all ready to get back to the new academic year. Early Childhood Ireland's podcast features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to high quality in the early years and school-age care sector. In our episodes, we've a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Advocacy Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So visit www.aricus.ie for more information. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. Every year around this time of the year, organisations like Early Childhood Ireland make submissions to government in advance of the budget announcement in October. As we prepare for this submission, we look at what our sector needs to ensure quality for children. We take into account what provision is already in place, what our members are telling us, and we look at national and international research into early years and school-age care. Once again this year, I'm delighted to tease out some of the detail in our Budget 2024 submission. And to do that, I'm joined by my colleague, Frances Byrne. Frances is the Director of Policy, Advocacy and Campaigning in Early Childhood Ireland, and she has a huge interest in advocating for children in early years and school-age care in our member settings in Ireland. Frances, you're most welcome, and thank you for joining me today. And I'm looking forward to teasing out some of the background and some of the asks and proposals we have in the budget submission.
Thanks, Maura. Delighted to be here.
So, I mentioned about the background and how we prepared the submission. Can you give us maybe a little bit of background into how we develop the budget submission, how we decide what we're going to focus on? This year, for example, there's specific mention of the needs of children experiencing poverty and disadvantage. So I'd love to hear a bit about how we get from the planning stage to the actual published document.
Yeah, absolutely. So every year, we, I suppose, maybe around April, start looking at what specifics we're going to include. So our small team in Early Childhood Ireland, the policy team, starts putting together what we call our master document. So that document contains proposals that we have looked for before that haven't been accepted or haven't been accepted in full. We look very carefully at a range of data, evidence, research to see, what is happening anyway in relation to the sector. So therefore, we don't really necessarily have to prioritize it in the budget submission. We also look at what are we most concerned about as an organisation in terms of what we know from our significant membership is happening on a day-to-day basis that's impacting on quality for children first and foremost. We also look at, we have an ongoing monitoring system in Early Childhood Ireland where we have recorded every commitment that government has made through various, the programme for government, First Five, the various reports that have come out during the last few years, the National Childminding Action Plan and so on. And we measure using publicly available data and information that we gather from, interim reports. Some advisory group meetings are put up by the department on gov.ie, on the First Five site. We look at them. We look at, what has the Minister and others been saying in public, and what can we measure by the advisory and other groups that we are on. So that all goes on anyway. So, we would be looking at that. We would be looking at the key documents, that nurturing skills, partnership for the public good, to see where is the government there. So this document actually it's really, really big. And then I suppose the piece that definitely doesn't get into the public domain is we also look at things that would not be good for children and would be harmful to children directly and or to the system overall. And we prepare arguments against them. So some listeners might remember a few years ago, the so-called granny grant that an independent minister at some point in the summer had this great idea. And I shouldn't be using sarcasm on the podcast. I apologize. But to him, it was a great idea, and of course, to us, it was a very bad idea because it was a tax credit in all but name. Two very significant independent commissions had looked at this and had given excellent reasons why it was not a good idea. But for us, the big reason was it has absolutely no impact on quality. So because we had prepared our arguments against tax, giving tax credits, no matter who they were to, we were able to respond, dip into our master document very quickly, go out very quickly on it and say, this is not a good idea, and here's why, and it isn't just us saying it. So that's one of the reasons why we look at things that might be in the ether or might have been proposed. And also it gives us an annual opportunity to interrogate some of those ideas. So there are things that we might say they're not for now, but down the line, there might be room for things. So that document gets worked on, and simultaneously we are deciding as an organization what we're going to prioritize. In the last few years, we have introduced the discipline of one ask, if you like. So we looked for the single agency, and we were delighted to get that into the programme for government. We looked for a 5-year plan last year. But this year we have decided, because of the juncture that we find ourselves at in terms of the halfway point of First Five, very critical periods of implementing the childminding action plan, and the impact that the National Childcare Scheme increase last year has had, and we just made the decision we can't. There are too many things, and actually we were lucky to get it down to 5. And then we distill them down. We ask ourselves lots of questions about the impacts, negative and positive, on children in settings, on settings themselves. And then we go into a kind of an internal, wider than our team consultation, and then we make our final decisions, and it goes over to brilliant design people on our communications team, who do a brilliant job every year. And this year, I think, once again, it's gorgeous. And that's important. That might sound very superficial, Maura, but actually it's really important, because we're very conscious that, as you've said, we're one of hundreds of not just absolutely NGOs, but business lobbies, trade unions, lots of people are writing budget submissions. So we want it to be clear, we want it to be eye-catching, and we try and keep it quite short so that it will be read and digested. And then we have a whole plan for how we launch it into the world and engage with policymakers about it.
Looking at some of the specifics, you mentioned that last year the ask was the 5-year plan, and that's top of our list this year. Can you take us through, has any of that been addressed? Why it's back again, and what we mean by the 5-year plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose originally we would have put it in because there was the commitment to double funding in 2018 terms by 2028 and reach almost $1 billion. So last year we had, I can't say we had a big win, children had a big win, but obviously we were delighted and quite surprised that the 1 billion, there was an announcement that essentially the 1 billion would be exceeded in 2023.
Happened sooner
but
than
we were
thought.
Very disappointed, but very disappointed not to see a plan. First of all, an announcement about, well, what are you going to do after that? Because 1 billion, though, it's absolutely welcome and so important that it happened, and you couldn't be anything but, welcoming and praising the government for it. It's such an important milestone moment. There's no question about that. But we all know, including government, that it's not enough in terms of compared to other countries. So I suppose we're asking this year for the commitment of 1% of GDP. That comes with a health warning, because the Minister for Finance last year mentioned that he would like to now have Ireland measure spending using a different measure, but there's been no progress on that. So we have stuck in Early Childhood Ireland. We took the decision, and again, that was part of the decision making. So that would mean 4 billion. So we want that commitment, but as importantly, we want the plan. So that would mean reaching 4 billion, in other words, another 3 by January 2029. But we want the plan, and we want the plan because one of the gaping holes in the Irish system, there's lots that people are really proud of. And, as I often say to colleagues, if you want to change the conversation with a member who's feeling under pressure and put upon, and you want to move on and you don't want to leave a conversation in a terrible place, you mention Ashter or you mention AIM, so there are wonderful things happening within the sector. We've seen outdoor guidance. I think our members can be so proud of the contribution that they made to influence the new guidance. I think similarly with the sleep guidance, we're still looking at that. But again, I think members have led the way as they led the way through
Absolutely.
COVID. But they're doing that in the background of a complete lack of certainty. And that's what I mean by, the difficulty. So for us, we have staffing first and foremost in our minds when we're looking for the 5-year plan. So we're operating at the moment in a scenario where we're relying on annual talks to take place between trade unions and employers to produce an employment regulation order. And that's great. And, I'm not criticizing that in the sense that there is an employment order, and, that has to happen legally now. That has uncertainty attached to it, not to put too fine a point on it, but it means that every year settings are waiting for that news. Educators, operators are waiting for that news. I'm the manager of a setting and I hire you, Maura. All I can really talk to you about and put in your contract is whatever comes out of the ERO and whatever top up I can afford to make if I have one, and if there's a graduate premium and I'm passing that on. But if there was a 5-year plan and I roughly knew the amount of money that was going to be, if you like, sliced off for staffing every year, for staffing as in terms and conditions of staff, rather, I should say. If I knew that there was going to be a learners fund every year for the next 4 years, or whatever, and capital and so on, it would allow me to give you certainty. It would allow me to give parents certainty. It would allow me to know, actually, I can plan now as far as 2027 fairly confidently. Maybe I won't go beyond that, or maybe the end of 2025. I mean, we have members who'd be over the moon if they could do proper planning for the next 2 program years or the next 3, and it would just allow certainty for everybody. It's what happens in other countries. We have a very interesting partnership at the moment, which is called quality daycare, because that's what childminding is called in various parts of Europe. And one of the partners is Denmark. And we were over there in June, a group of us, for our second visit. And we met the person who's in charge of children and youth for a quite small 42,000 inhabitants of a suburb of Copenhagen. And it is her job legally to plan in 2 and 5 year cycles. So if she knows there's an apartment block, new housing, she looks at demographics in terms of births, and she cannot legally allow a situation to emerge. She is responsible if any family at the age of 1 year needs childminding or centre-based care, or then what they call kindergarten, what we would call preschool, obviously, at the age of 3. She is legally responsible for that. We have no such system in Ireland, and this speaks to our 5th ask. But it's also why we want the 5-year plan, so that people can have that certainty and plan their lives. And most importantly of all for us is give certainty to staff. So to sum up why we would really want the 5-year plan, for us it's about staffing. We know in Early Childhood Ireland, we tell policymakers all the time, the department knows, there's overwhelming evidence that one of the ways that you ensure quality in every setting is consistent relationships with highly qualified staff. So for us, that certainty that operators can provide to educators and practitioners is a key reason why we have repeatedly asked for a 5-year plan.
And, you know, I mean, one of the biggest things that people talk about anytime we talk to members is about the staffing crisis and how hard it is to retain staff. And, you know, that impacts on quality so much. So that security, consistency is good for everybody.
It's good for everybody. And yeah, absolutely. And of course, most importantly, good for children, you know.
For the children. You mentioned, Ash, the curriculum framework, and I know we mentioned Reggio in the budget submission as well. Can you take us through a little bit of the thinking behind the influence of Reggio on our plans in Early Childhood Ireland and our asks of government in the budget?
So there was some very helpful joined up thinking within the organisation during the last few years, just about, even though we didn't know about the billion in advance, but just about the responsibility we have as Early Childhood Ireland, as the leading, organisation, to be able to answer the question, if the Minister for Children knocked on your door tomorrow and said, I have another billion, we have to be able to answer the question, what should I spend it on? And we were absolutely delighted that with great support from National Pajama Day, the organisation was able to embed our relationship with Reggio Children post-COVID. We're the Irish Network member. And so that project funded by National Pajama Day really got us to, I suppose, our policy team to stand back and look at it and make a decision and be brave to say, yes, actually, we think that this is what should be further considered. It's already there in Ashter. The philosophy is there. It's world renowned. It has an absolute dimension about the responsibility around advocacy for children, advocacy for community, advocacy for the approach. We thought it fitted very neatly. The project gave us the opportunity during the week when the colleagues from Reggio Emilia were here to meet an Oireachtas committee, the key Oireachtas committee on children, and brief them about Reggio Emilia. And it was really heartening to see pennies dropping, to see people, who have a lot of things coming at them, not just early years and school age care, really getting it and understanding it. So we decided that it's really important that we're highlighting that this is not the exclusive way to go. Of course, there are lots of other very important approaches already embedded within our system here, but that we would really like to see more embedding of Reggio Children and the Reggio Emilia approach, because we really think that it highlights the rights of children in a particular way, and we think it's really appropriate for the way the system is already developing within Ireland, even at a policy level. When you take out the policy documents that are hugely influential now in the overall direction, you can see consideration of the importance of educators. You can see consideration of the rights of children. You can see particularly concerns and considerations about children with special rights, as they're known by Reggio Children. So we have decided to take all of that and add it into our budget submission this year.
And I suppose, as we've discussed in the podcast series we did on Reggio, it isn't something you transplant from Italy to here. It's a philosophy that underpins all the other approaches and is very implicit in Ashter. And, it's a way of working with children, valuing children, seeing them as citizens that isn't exclusive or excluding of other approaches. So it's a really good foundation to build on and to contextualize here.
And again, you know, one of the considerations when we were writing our master document was Early Childhood Ireland also feels a responsibility to not well, to try and add to the public discourse, which understandably is very focused on affordability and fees, to supporting and, dare I say, empowering policymakers and parents and others to really have those public conversations about quality for children. And as you said, children as citizens in their own right. It was really very welcome to see that members of the Children's Committee in the Oireachtas really reacted well and embraced the language of children with special rights. I think that's a whole new way of thinking about our language. So I don't mean this in a superficial way, like in a very serious way, Early Childhood Ireland wants to move the conversation on. Because we've never really had that conversation publicly in Ireland about quality for children. The conversation always goes to parents and the adults in the room, you know, when really it should be laser focused on quality for children.
Even down to things like, you know, children are described as future citizens, like they only become citizens when they're entitled to vote. And that, you know, they're citizens when they're born.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, what's really fascinating is that these conversations are taking place within members and between members all the time, but they don't really spill out into the wider the wider public. And I think that this allows us as an organization, allows members, allows educators to have those conversations about children, about their rights, about, you know, those really important connections with educators, with families, with communities. And we know that happens, and it is happening, but it isn't really being there isn't a lot of light being shone on it. And I think that the group of educators who went over as part of the project supported by National Pajama Day, like, they've come back, and, you know, we're sort of calling them ambassadors on our team, because every time we've an interaction with them, we're kind of blown away by how inspired and inspiring they are, how important this work has become to them. And they've already done fantastic things in the public domain, including on the media, you know, and it's been brilliant to hear them so confidently and easily talk about this and link it to their everyday work. They're almost unconscious ambassadors, you know. It's so natural that they don't even realize that they're actually inspiring their listeners. You know, it's brilliant. Like, it's the best
fantastic.
Yeah.
And the blog, you know, we sought blogs from the people who went, blog posts for Skealta, and we, you know, we're publishing them in an incremental way, and, you know, they're just so passionate and inspiring, and, you know, it was great to get them kind of immediately after people came back, when that, you know, passion was at its height. So it's a very you know, it's really good to have those kinds of discussions. Now, you know, the funding and affordability is important, and I'm going to come to that next, because one of our other asks is about unifying the funding schemes. Now, wasn't and I may be being a bit naughty here myself, wasn't the National Childcare Scheme supposed to do that?
So certainly there was an understanding that the National Childcare Scheme was going to unify or address the attendance and the attendance rules, if you like. And you can certainly argue that it does, and, you know, and I'm not going to go into it because members who are listening will know this inside out and backwards. But it isn't as smooth as it could be. And yet we have core funding where it's not about attendance as much as it is about capacity, and Early Childhood Ireland would say that that's the way every scheme should be. But one of the knock-on effects of the relaxation of the rules, particularly around the National Childcare Scheme, the attendance rules during COVID, was that parents now have expectations. And also there's a lot of parents who have far more family-friendly, human-friendly ways of working post-COVID than they would have had before. So they're looking for some flexibility around hours and so on. And it's just ridiculous that settings are not able to allow that to happen. We know that there were rigorous systems put in place during COVID to ensure that the relaxation wasn't abused. There's no reason why they couldn't become permanent checks. It should be tied to the needs of the child. In other countries that are investing a lot more money than we are, attendance, non-attendance of a child or a variation in attendance by a child at most would trigger a family support intervention. If suddenly a child wasn't showing up and there was no contact from a parent or guardian, then there would be a phone call and there would be some concern, but there wouldn't be a reduction in program money to settings, because that's not in the best interest of children. And as we know, if there's a lot of variation and or flexibility is given, it can have an impact on ratios and therefore on staffing. So it's just not enlightened. It's not for the 21st century that we have, funding programs with different attendance rules. The attendance rules should be changed so that flexibility can be offered, so that the reality of children's lives can be reflected in them, and that there's no knock-on consequences then in terms of fees for parents or the amount of funding that providers get. And as I said, this is one of these things that when you describe it to people in other countries, on top of the administrative burden and so on that goes with it, people just actually look at you like you're crazy and that you're not, they're seriously doubting that you're telling them the truth. But of course we are.
Yeah.
So that needs to change. It's not in the best interest of children, and it really isn't rocket science to change that. As I said, if there are concerns about fraud, there are ways to, whatever the concerns are, there are ways to deal with that, and countries that are investing a lot more manage it. So I'm sure it's not, outside our abilities to manage it.
Yeah, I mean, there has to be accountability, but the admin overload is just ferocious at the moment. And
yeah. Absolutely. And the other side of it is, you would have the most highly qualified people very often doing the admin.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, as members say, that's taking the most highly qualified people off the floor, as they describe it, out of rooms. That's not good either. So the impact of it within settings, the impact of it on families is just not welcome. And if one program, which is core funding, can allow capacity as the funding measurement, don't understand why that can't happen across the board. It absolutely should.
Frances, we're also, we've touched on the flexibility for families without penalties for settings. That ties in with the funding programs and is much more progressive way to go. We also mentioned increasing the graduate premium. I presume that's aimed at kind of at retention and security and secure relationships and so on as well, to retain staff and recognise their additional qualifications.
Absolutely. It absolutely is all of that. And this reality that we're facing now as a sector, which is that every year there's a sector employment order. We all hope it gets across the line every year, but there may be a year when it doesn't. So there needs to be an additional mechanism, which there is through the graduate premiums, and we're saying that needs to be increased. And also there's a commitment in First 5 that the sector will be graduate-led by 2028, and that needs to be that needs to be incentivized. And again, it goes back to the earlier conversation, so that educators and practitioners in settings can have certainty about their immediate medium-term and long-term careers. We want the best people coming into settings and staying. And so that this is why our fourth ask is focused on the graduate premiums.
And then, just as we start to get to the end, can you tell us a little bit about the final proposal, which is the better data recommendation from the report, the Partnership for the Public Good? That's about places where and when they're needed.
So there's nobody at the moment who has responsibility for doing this. We hope that when the single agency is established, that it will have a statutory remit around planning. So by and large, and I know that there are communities in Ireland where this hasn't happened. In fact, I live in one where it didn't happen in the past. But by and large, people who are becoming parents today, in whatever circumstances, will be fairly confident, if not 100% confident, depending on where they're living, that there'll be a school place for their child when they turn 5. There's no such guarantee within our system, within the early years and school age system. So even though there's parts of it, so for example, ECHI exists and people have a right to it, but that doesn't guarantee you a place. There's nobody with responsibility for that. And at the same time, as the expert group that wrote Partnership for the Public Good recognised, that the data exists. The department itself is collecting via Pubble and others an enormous amount of data. So it is possible to do better planning. As I said earlier, in countries that are spending multiples of what we spend, and obviously in some ways it's easier because it's devolved to the local authority. There's a responsibility around 2 and 5 year planning cycles. There's no reason why that couldn't happen here at a national level and then rolled out locally if needs be, or a local system that reports into a national one, and so on. So that access, equality of access to places in settings and in childminders' homes, is guaranteed and becomes a reality for children in their own communities. We think it's really important. We think in a country of this size, it's entirely doable. And we would certainly like to see the department really focus on those, what the expert group called the better data aspects, which are throughout Partnership for the Public Good. And it's definitely, they definitely need to be implemented. And of course, the argument that they made, which is a completely valid one, is that, look, clearly there's going to be more investment made, and therefore the money needs to be spent properly, spent appropriately. And I don't mean in the sense of the earlier conversation about accountability. I mean invested in the right things, but also invested in the right areas geographically, ensuring that children of all needs, all backgrounds, all communities, all first and second languages, whether they're English or not, are accommodated within both centres and childminders' homes. And, it sounds like rocket science, but it isn't. Other countries do it well, and we should be doing it. And, it goes back to us having that very equitable, very accessible, child-centred system that is focused on children's rights. And of course, then there's a wider conversation to be had about participation within settings and all of that. But in terms of access, there's no reason why we couldn't have better planning. Absolutely no reason why. And it really, really needs to happen. We will be making the argument that it's in the best interest of children, but of course it's in the best interest of the public, who are paying for the system, and need to feel that they can rely on it, and need to feel that, as I said, every child in every community is getting a place that's appropriate to them, where they can receive the highest level quality of early years and or school age care and education. Early Childhood Ireland wants to see that become taken for granted, in the same way that we take a lot of our primary and secondary education provision for granted. So we should, it's not, and within that we value teachers, don't we?
Absolutely.
So it is possible to take it for granted in the sense that we expect to receive it, but really value it, and that's what we want to see.
And that, that parents aren't booking places in a creche before they tell their own parents that they're pregnant, because they don't know if they'll, that they know they'll need a place in a year and a half's time, or whatever. That, it should just be a service that's there, that you book in when you know you're going to need it.
Absolutely, and as that's the taking for granted piece, that you highly value it, but you completely expect and receive an appropriate place for your child, for your family, and it goes back to that certainty around planning for everybody. And as I said, in a country this size, with lots of excellent statisticians across the board who are able to project into the future about how many children are arriving, and babies and so on. It's absolutely possible to do this, and it would mean that we could all be satisfied that the greater investment that we hope is to continue is being spent well, and it's being spent on the children, through vindicating their rights to it. I mean, I think that's part of the conversation, and that's why the Regio project is so important. That conversation about vindicating children's rights. You're in other places, as I said, you're in Denmark and other places, and it's just totally expected. It's absolutely outside the expectation of parents and the wider community that there wouldn't be a place, either, as I said, within childminding or within a centre for children. Yeah, so it's doable, and we really need to do it.
Absolutely. Frances, thanks so much for all that really interesting analysis on our Budget 2024 submission. And it's just so important for our youngest citizens, for their families, that government build on the existing funding and provision to ensure quality in all kinds of settings going forward. So, Frances, thank you so much.
Thank you, Maura.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Aricus. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and spread the word to your friends and colleagues, and stay tuned for our next episode.